They've done it again. This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Disaster, catastrophe, embarrassment, whatever pun you want to use to describe it, I'm sure we can all agree that the best way to describe Haas's 2021 season would be a steaming heap of shit. Of course, this hasn't come as much of a surprise, as they were a team on the fall anyway, and when they signed 2 rookie drivers and decided not to bother developing their 2021 car at all, they sort of signed their own fate. But last weekend in Mexico was the moment I came to the conclusion that Haas are really taking the piss with this whole F1 team thing. So I wanted this video to be a few minutes of my finest waffle on that very subject. Enjoy. I can't really explain why, but I've never quite seen Haas as a genuine Formula 1 team. Like, even when they got 4th in the Constructors' Championship in 2018, they did so in such a way that I still saw them as a bottom team. Again, I can't explain what exactly they're doing to make me feel this way, but they just are, you know? As some of you may already be aware, Haas don't make much of their own Formula 1 car, so we can't hold the blame against them entirely. Most of their car is a hand-me-down from Ferrari, so in fact the 2021 and 2020 Haas cars are almost exactly the same as the 2019 Ferrari. And as you may remember, that Ferrari wasn't exactly a rocket ship through the corners. Now, while this of course means that Haas can and have saved money on development, it's had the consequence of making it a challenge for Haas to develop their own cars, as they're not theirs. I'm really interested to see how 2022 pans out for the team, because not only have they been pouring every ounce of their resources into designing it for the last year, but it'll be one of very few cars of theirs that won't be taking influence from a Ferrari, as there's no Ferrari that's designed to those regulations. It's hard to say whether or not that'll be a good thing yet, but I'll say now that there's very little doubt in my mind that they won't be fighting at the front. They're operating on a budget of about 60 pence in a Mars bar, so what do you expect? But anyway, I've got sidetracked already. The point of this video isn't to speculate, so let's talk about 2021. Oh boy. Haas pulled the covers off their latest and greatest invention, the VF21, on the 4th of March. And it was, how do I put this? Russian. Now, I personally quite like the design. It's definitely one of the better ones this year, but it was certainly a bold move from Haas's usual design, and one that was met with mixed opinions. And speaking of nice designs, I know I've been put off from buying things from a website before if it looks dodgy, and I think that's just human instinct. We're used to all these big companies having fancy websites to flex their products on, but what about you and me? Well, you may not want to sell things, but you might want to have a good-looking online portfolio to show your clients, or a blog to talk about how much you love the John Warren YouTube channel. And of course, you could have a shop if you wanted to. Whatever it is you want to do, Squarespace should be top of your list when it comes to doing it. They've got loads of templates to choose from to start the ball rolling, and they're super easy to customize to make sure you don't end up looking the same as everyone else. And if you don't like any of the templates, then you can start from scratch. There really is no excuse for your website to look like this, is there? If you want to have a play around with Squarespace, then just head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you've made something you want to share with the world, then go to squarespace.com/JohnWarren and use code JohnWarren for 10% off your first website or domain. Anyway, back to Haas. Whether or not you like the livery though, that doesn't affect the performance of the car. Everybody knows you have to put the go faster stripes down the center. Rookie mistake. Livery aside, let's talk about this absolute bust, shall we? Its debut in preseason testing was slow, obviously. Nikita Mazepin managed 69 laps on the first day, and Mick managed 15. Mazepin was unusually the faster of the two, with a 1 minute 34.798 recorded, which was 4.1 seconds off the pace. Wow. The second day was no better, with Mick this time having the faster lap, and the gap narrowed to 2.5 seconds, but even so, Haas were the slowest of any team to do some meaningful, sandbag-free running. I'm looking at you, Mercedes. Nikita took the faster lap on the final day, but again it was 2.5 seconds off the pace, which impressively was one of the closest gaps between the Haas cars and the actual Formula 1 cars this season. Bahrain went just as badly as expected for Haas, with Nikita's debut consisting of about 1 million spins and ending just one braking zone into the race. Mick's race was less bad, with just the one spin and no fatality, but this was quite the statement Haas had made, and it really wasn't a good one. Fast forward a few spins and we're in Silverstone, which I was lucky enough to see with my own eyes. Abbey is usually flat out in a Formula 1 car, and comfortably so, but every time the Haas cars came through turn 1, you could hear them take a huge lift, and they were a good 15 miles an hour slower than the one remaining Red Bull. And sure, that meant I could admire the livery for longer, but that's not what I was sat there to do. Now let's talk about blue flags. After all, I spent a good 15 minutes adding one into the thumbnail, so it's only right that I waste some breath on the subject. We give a lot of flack to Nikita Mazepin for being pretty terrible at getting out of the way, but we forget that some of the blame has to be put on the team. After all, it's the team's responsibility to let the drivers know when they'll be lapped and when they should get out of the way. But then again, Mick Schumacher seems to be doing well enough with following blue flags. Apart from in Austin. As well as the blue flags during racing, Mazepin especially has made quite the habit of holding people up in qualifying. Credit where due, he hasn't done it in a while, but he's still done it a lot more than he should have done. I saw a self-proclaimed article on Twitter the other day that Mick is having more crashes than Nikita because he's not scared of the car, while Nikita is. In fact, this article, or whatever we're going to call it, said that Mazepin had asked to be changed back to the original spec chassis in the car because he was scared of the speed and wanted a heavier chassis. Again, this is Twitter, so I don't exactly believe it, but it's certainly food for thought. And if you thought Mick was off the pace in that absolute dog, then Mazepin is literally in the next month. His average gap to Mick has been around half a second, and he's still yet to outqualify him bar the 2 times Mick's missed qualifying. And that brings me on to those crashes. You see, Haas have made it very clear that the reason they're not focusing on 2021 is so they can save money on development which can be spent on next year's car, to hopefully give them a leg up with the new regulations. But with its 2 drivers causing a combined $5 million worth of damage to the cars, plus the many hours of machine time it's required to make those parts again, Haas have really shot themselves in the foot with its driver pairing. Sure, K-Mag and Romain Grosjean aren't the cream of the crop when it comes to racing drivers, and they certainly got through their fair share of front wings, but they were pretty decent, well-experienced drivers who didn't demand some ridiculous salary for their services either. If Haas had held on to these 2 drivers for this year, then sure, they would not have got the Uralkali sponsorship deal, and they would probably have been spending more on salaries than they are now, but at the same time, wouldn't they have been able to benefit from the experience of those 2 drivers? Again, it's just food for thought, but in my eyes, they should have only signed 1 rookie, even if it was Mazepin. So finally, let's get on to the subject that prompted me to make this video, the Mexican Grand Prix. Mexico is quite a short track, both in lap time and in physical length, so for Haas to have finished the first practice session in last by a margin of 4 seconds was worrying. The fastest lap in that session was a 1 minute 18, and Haas could only manage a 1 minute 22. Putting that into perspective, that means that Haas were lapping at 105% of the leader's times. In fact, if Mazepin was just half a second slower, then he would have been outside the 107% time. I genuinely can't remember a time when a team's been this bad before. Even HRT could lap closer to the leaders than this, and that's really saying something. FP2 was no better really, with Max Verstappen putting in a 1:17.3 and Mazepin a 1:21.5. Again, this was at 105% of the leader's time. Perez topped FP3 with a 1:17 dead, and Mazepin was last, again, with a 1:20.4. This was at 104.5% of the leader's time, so an improvement, but still shit. Qualifying was par for the course by Haas's standards, with the pole time being a 1:15.8, while Haas were out in Q1 with Mazepin setting a 1:19.3. This was again at 104.5% of the leader's time. The most embarrassing thing about this session though was the fact that Haas were beaten on the first runs of qualifying by Lance Stroll, who crossed the line backwards with half a car. Like, how are they genuinely that slow? When Mazepin occupied his usual spot of last of the cars that finish, he was then congratulated on a good lap by his team, which just made it all the more funny in my eyes. Like, I know they made him angry earlier by telling him not to perform his usual qualifying antics of passing everyone on the outlap and then spinning in front of them all, and I know that meant they had the threat of losing all their sponsorship cash as a result, but come on, you don't congratulate someone on a good lap if they haven't even got within the same millennium as their teammate. That's just rude, if nothing else. The race somehow was even worse than the start of their weekend. Mick Schumacher was killed in turn 2 through no real fault of anyone, but the issue here isn't about him adding to the repair bill again. It was the fact that Nikita Mazepin started in the lofty heights of 15th, had 4 people crash in front of him and was briefly running 11th, before finishing last of those who finished. 3 laps down. Even more worrying was the fact he was lapped by Nicholas Latifi, who was second last of the finishers. How are they this slow? But like seriously, I find it so sad to think about how there are people who have to work on these cars for a living. Like, being a mechanic for every other team would be fun, because for one, you get to see the cars develop over the season, and as well as that, you get to experience the pure joy of when your team gets a good result, whether that's a points finish or a podium or a win. But Haas's employees literally get none of that. The closest they've had to joy is when both drivers make it through a weekend without smashing their car into a million pieces, or when Mick made it into Q2, and even that was ruined by the sheer terribleness of the VF21 in the race. Of course, they might have something incredible lined up for next season that all the employees are holding out for, but I just can't see that happening. They could have the best engineers in the business, but you're not going to get that far unless you have the budget to make what they design. And as I said in the beginning of this video, Haas really don't give me that top team sort of vibe, and I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that Haas are always fighting for their F1 future, even when they're doing well. Teams such as Red Bull and Ferrari have had bad years in the sport, but never really bad. Haas just seem to have this volatility where they can go from a decent car to totally useless in about 5 minutes. But yeah, I think that's all the waffling I can come up with, so if this is your first time here and you enjoyed this video, then a sub will be much appreciated. While you're down there, don't forget to leave a like, and let me know in the comments what you think about Haas's prospects for next year. Thank you for watching, and I will see you all later.